Hi everyone, Carter Krishna here for the Florida Squeeze, and wanted to talk about a major event today in history, which took place on May 29th, 1586, and involved the person of Sir Francis Drake, one of the most famous people in English history, British history. It was England at the same time. So let's talk about the sacking. When the English settled their first permanent outpost in what is now the southern United States, Florida was a somewhat prosperous colony. St. Augustine had been founded in 1565. Obviously, there had been numerous attempts before 1565, most notably Tristan de Luna in 1559 in what is the now Pensacola, to settle Florida. What ends up happening is St. Augustine is founded in 1565, becomes fairly prosperous, and gets burned down in the Anglo-Spanish War of the 1580s in 1586, which is, of course, a war that culminated with the defeat of the Spanish Armada, where Sir Francis Drake was present at that battle. So let's talk about Sir Francis Drake. Drake, en route to make contact with Sir Walter Raleigh's Roanoke Island, which had just been founded, that's a big event in American history, gets a lot of ink spilled, whereas events in Florida history don't get quite as much love. He was making his way to Roanoke Island. Drake, who had obviously circumnavigated the globe several years earlier, as I think many people know, and there's some great books about him circumnavigating the globe, including one on, I think it's called In Search of a Kingdom. And that talks about the desire of Elizabethan England, which had become rabidly anti-Catholic, to really kind of create an empire of its own to rival Spain, which of course Spain was Catholic. Drake harbored a deep hatred of Catholicism, not unlike many other prominent figures in Elizabethan England, as we just talked about. One of the most controversial figures in English history, Drake circumnavigated the globe from 1577 to 1580, which is 6 years prior to this thing. And he was raiding Spanish ports of call throughout the Spanish Empire, even in places like the Philippines, right? And those were backed really by the crown, by the English, by the government in Westminster in England, that committed to anti-Spanish, anti-Catholic activities. So this Anglo-Spanish War began in 1585, and Drake, already having been knighted, so he was already Sir Francis Drake, for his exploits in that 1577 to 1580 period, began raiding Spanish settlements in the New World. The war was declared by Philip II of Spain after Queen Elizabeth had begun supporting the Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands. That's part of the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands, which is a whole different conflict. But England at this point intervenes on behalf of the Protestants who are trying to break themselves off of the Habsburg Spanish Empire. Drake was aware of the massacre of French Huguenots in 1565 around St. Augustine. That's, of course, Matanzas, right? Where Fort Matanzas is now today on the Matanzas River, how the Matanzas River got its name. The massacre meant, of course, that David Ingram, who I talk about in the book I've written, Florida and the British prior to the American Revolution, would not be able to settle in Florida. After raiding Santo Domingo on Spanish Hispaniola, now the Dominican Republic, Drake, en route to Roanoke Island, set sail for St. Augustine, not only to strike a blow strategically against the Spanish, but to avenge the deaths of his fellow Protestants 2 decades later. According to various sources, Drake had upwards of 2,000 men, 22 heavy ships, and 19 auxiliary ships as he descended on St. Augustine. The settlement of Roanoke by Sir Walter Raleigh to the north also, as I mentioned earlier, motivated Drake, as maybe they could engulf the Spanish colony of Spanish Florida with aid and assistance to the settlement at Roanoke Island. Arriving in the inlet that flanked the Spanish settlement on May 27, 1586, Drake's forces bombarded a small wooden fort, which is the predecessor of the Castillo de San Marcos, which would not be built for about another 100 years after this. The Spanish fled inland and abandoned the fort. As the English, led by naval commander Christopher Carriel, rode inland to investigate, they discovered Nicolas Bourguignon, a French Huguenot prisoner, abandoned in a boat. And so this prisoner guided Drake's party towards the settlement. Pedro Menendez de Marquez, the governor of Florida, had limited men with which to resist Drake's superior numbers with his raiding party. So his forces and the citizens of the town fled inland. Drake's party, meanwhile, occupied the wooden fort on the night of May 28th, morning of May 29th. but were attacked by Native American allies of the Spanish. In the abandoned fort, they found 2,000 gold ducats that had been mistakenly left behind by the Spanish in their hasty retreat from the fort. However, apparently other treasure had been removed in advance of Drake's raid and moved inland. The English beat back the Native Americans and on May 29th made their way into St. Augustine. Drake and Carolel now led 200 men into the town. The town had been abandoned, but the Spanish were lurking in the scrub nearby. They attacked the British and killed Anthony Powell, one of Carolel's lieutenants. Carolel then charged the Spanish, inflicting about a dozen losses and wounding several others. Drake was therefore left in the possession of the town overnight. Much of Drake's rage towards St. Augustine was caused by the killing of Powell, who was a personal friend of Drake's. But some sources claim the lack of treasure remaining in St. Augustine, because it had all been withdrawn, prompted Drake's anger. In either event, whatever the case was, St. Augustine was destroyed. On May 29th and May 30th, Drake's men torched the town, destroying every single building in the settlement as well as the fort. They also took all the remaining heavy artillery and gold from the town. The English party left St. Augustine and sailed off towards Roanoke Island. And so 2 years later, Drake would be among the English commanders to defeat the Spanish Armada. And it wasn't just some random act of piracy. In fact, it may have been encouraged and sanctioned by Queen Elizabeth herself. Drake's raid had major impacts as the Spanish crown decided to consolidate its Florida settlement at St. Augustine, abandoning points north, including Parris Island and St. Helena, which are now both in South Carolina. Spanish Florida would be, for the foreseeable future, consolidated around St. Augustine. This is before the missions, El Camino Real road is built into the hinterland of Florida, and Spanish missions pop up in the rest of what is now what we consider North Florida and Northeast Florida. The aftermath of Drake's raid also led to a greater fortification of St. Augustine. The consolidation of Spanish settlements along the Atlantic coast near St. Augustine increased security and led into the 1600s, which were a fairly prosperous time for Spanish Florida, relatively speaking. Not quite like Mexico and Latin America in New Spain, but more prosperous than the English colonies to the north. In 1597, partly as a result of Drake's raid, Spain began a policy of trying to make alliances with the native populations, but much of this was around the idea of them converting to Catholicism, but that's how the mission system began to sprung up in Florida, and we had a number of missions, Spanish missions in Florida before the more famous Spanish missions in Texas were built, and then obviously missions in California about 200 years later were built. So, big event in Florida history, May 27th through May 30th of 1586.